Get going.
Very good.
All right. Hang on, just one more thing. All right. This is the Mystic River Boathouse Implementation Committee Park Management Subcommittee meeting. It's Tuesday, December 1st at 5:00 p.m. I'm Sandy Tashir. I'm the recording secretary. And those present are Mike O'Neill, Steve Planchon, Richard Ward, Nick Keppel, Susan Cullen, Timothy O'Brien, Deb Downey, Mike Crowley, and that's it for right now. Okay, you can call the meeting to order. Oh, and make sure that when you're not talking to put your microphone on mute. Thank you. And identify yourselves when you're talking. Thank you.
Okay, this is Nick Keppel. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank everyone for taking the time as we are in the midst of the holiday season. So
you need to call the meeting to order.
Oh, need to call the meeting to order. Do we want to do the Pledge of Allegiance?
I believe we have to because it's on the agenda.
Yep.
All right. Actually, join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I have Mike's agenda. Bear with me 2 seconds. So, Sandy, what's next on the agenda? Comments from the public, maybe?
Yes.
Any comments from the public? I don't expect there are. Here's Breck, joined us. Welcome, Brett.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So, and what's next, Sandy, on the agenda?
It's the Lovelace House discussion, review cost models for various options for the relocation and rehabilitation of the Lovelace House.
Okay. So, if I may, just for 2 seconds before we get into that, you know, this committee came about because of my request that we commence a discussion about the use of the park, and then Mike raised some concerns about, I think, legitimate concerns about the role of the building and what happens in the building, and the impact of that issue upon the issue of the management of the park. So I'm going to suggest that we...
Mr. Chairman, can I make one request? We've got 2 mics. Can we be specific about which mic? Just so that for the notes for Sandy.
Yes. So Mike O'Neill had sent me some material about the use of the house, and in his view, its potential impact on the use of the park. And so I'm basically suggesting that as we take up the issue of the use of the park, we, at Mike O'Neill's request, that we spend some time thinking about and sorting out the use of the historic building on the property, and then see whether Mike's notion that how we sort out the use of that building, and what impact it has on the use of the park. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the main function of this subcommittee is to be sorting out how the park will get managed. So I also want to say that I'd like to keep this meeting to about an hour, maybe a little bit past, but I think it's safe to say that we're not going to be able to cover the waterfront, as it were, on these issues approximately 1 hour meeting. And so I'm envisioning that we'll commence the discussion tonight, have our meeting next week, let the full committee know that we're working on this, and then I'm sure meet again soon after next week's meeting to continue these discussions. So with unless anybody has any questions, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mike O'Neill. Mindful that, Mike, to the extent that you can refer to stuff that I hope people have reviewed ahead of time and not need to spend a lot of time walking through the substantial amount of material that you sent us. But anyway, I'll give the floor over to Mike O'Neill.
And again, thank everybody else for joining us. Like the house is kind of a big component of the park. It's one that's kind of pivotal to the park moving forward, and it's been out there and been undefined for a while. If it's okay, I'd like to go through a quick history because I know a couple people have asked about how the house came about and kind of where it came from and why it came. So if I can just spend a minute talking about that. So initially, when the Friends of Stonington crew and the town of Stonington got together on the park project, the belief was that all of the structures on the park property were built after 1945 because that's what the street guard at the town said. So there was no belief that those buildings were historic or had any historic encumbrances whatsoever. As Rob and company, Jason, started talking with DECD and with the state about the project, they were basically told not to worry about the historic aspect of the property, that there was no issues there. So for that, there was no dollar amounts put in for historic, and that was by the instruction of the state from DECD. Once we got into the project, once we proposed our original boathouse project, which was removing all of the buildings on the site, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of what happened. The town got involved, or the local newspaper got involved and created an uproar. SHPO got involved, and through that process, they all of the buildings on the site in their current locations. And that didn't work in the original plans that were put together for the park because the house lies partially within the parking area on the park. And in our committee, we looked at a number of different parking scenarios, and the parking along that southern side of the property made the most sense because it left the most of the property available for people to use as a park. We looked at a version with a strip parking across the front. We looked at sense. In our negotiations with SHPO, once they got involved, we showed them 7 different scenarios of how we could potentially move the boathouse and potentially use, actually, I believe it was 9 different scenarios of how we could move the chessmen around the board, per se, as to different ways we could facilitate using the house, using the barn, and none of them were approved until about 10 or 15 feet to make room for the parking lot. SHPO liked that idea, but their preference was to move the house 88 feet to the north and flip it to the north side of the boathouse structure. And that's ultimately what they approved. That basically was agreed to by the town in a document, and I forget the exact terminology with the document, that the town would move forward. They would move the house 88 feet to the north, and that the boathouse would be placed to the south of it. And they did basically sign off on the conceptual design for the boathouse structures. So that's kind of where we are with the state as far as they're concerned. They also require that the house have a use. Ultimately, they didn't put a timeline on how soon it had to be a use, part of the plan sit on the site with no use. There had to be some utilization cooked into the house, and that the exterior of the house had to be restored basically with like in kind. So if it has wood siding on it now and the siding is at end of life, we have to put wood siding back. They wanted us to keep or replace the windows. They wanted us to keep the architectural detailing of the staggered shingles on the second floor and the clapboards on the first floor and the goofy little overhang that points out towards the street. All those on the back of the house, and to place the house as a two-story structure, so to basically eliminate the basement structure of the house. But as far as the state's concerned, that's what they agreed to, and that's kind of the basis of the starting of this conversation. So what I tried to do was take that information and look at different possible scenarios. And again, kind of my role and what I'm trying to accomplish is just to try and how the town might use the property, how the FOSS group might be able to contribute to that process, and ultimately what uses we might have for the house. And I know we've talked to Rich at Parks and Rec, and I know that Park and Rec is interested in potentially using the property. I know as a committee, we've talked a lot about the need for public restrooms and how we might facilitate those in the park. So what I try to do in the I can just kind of abbreviate through it, but what I try to do is say, what's the minimum we can possibly do, and what's the maximum we can possibly do, and what are the potential steps in between. So I gave you kind of the initial overview, which is just the bare minimum we need to do to move the house, to put it in the location that we've agreed to with the state, which is to basically tear down the shed, clean, provide structural fill, build a foundation, and move the house to the new foundation and stop. And I think it would be very easy for us as a town to say, hey, we don't really have a long-term plan yet. We're going to use it. We're still working on it, but that may be the first step we take with the house. And to do that process, if we do get the funding from DECD, there is monies to cover most of is the new the relocation or the new foundation for the building. But everything else, actually, excuse me, the relocation is covered. So yeah, just the foundation and the backfill are the only things that wouldn't be covered by the state if we were to take that step. So there's about a $40,000 cost to the town for a new foundation, and then I had another $10,000 just basically to board up the window, put power back on the house so that there was lighting. There could be a simple fire system in it, for security reasons. But that was the only thing I was doing in that scenario with the house, hooking it back up to the sewer system, just because while the ground's open, it's easier to do that, run the pipes through the house, run all of the different systems of the house. So that's kind of scenario one. Scenario two would be to go on the next step of that. Yep.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I just need to clarify, since we're talking about 4 or 5 different pots of money here that are paying for different things within this project, when you say that the state could potentially take care of part of what you're talking about, can you tell me which grant or funding system or whatever, so we can be specific about which pot of money is paying for which?
Sure. So in the DECD grant, and I have not seen the final version of it, but I know in Chad's original version of that, there was money for he had remediation money in for the house and remediation and money in for the relocation of the house. I would have to see the grant to know specifically where that is, and maybe I can talk to Chad, and for our meeting, our next meeting, I'll make sure we figure out exactly if that's there. But that,
Mike,
yes.
I'm sorry, there are two different DECD grants. One we've been working on that we're almost completed, the assessment grant, and then there's a remediation grant that we haven't applied for yet, and that it's not finalized yet because the notice of funding available yet because no bond has been actually proceeded with due to COVID. So you're talking about this being an included piece of the budget of the new grant that we haven't applied for yet.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, correct.
I'm just trying to make sure that I keep all the pots of money square of what people are referring to.
Absolutely, because
I was going to say, so we
not
had
writing the grants, I don't know specifically. I'm relying on Chad.
My office is writing the grant, Mike. So we can talk about that a little more offline about what's in the budget and what isn't.
Okay.
This is Debbie.
All right, so
that would be considered remediation, moving the house.
correct.
Whether it would actually fall into the definition of remediation. Certainly abating the house falls into that definition. But actually moving it, and maybe Chad had that discussion before.
I think Susan and Deb, I think you're both expressing what I'm most concerned about is we got to really clearly define which pots of money are coming out of what, and what's the risk, what's the cost implications for the rest of the group based on that. So as much as you want to work with Mike offline too, I'd like to see those numbers at some point and be very clear about what we think DECD would do from pot A and pot B from them. And I agree there's two pots. And then what's the risk and what's the cost basis for everyone else?
Yep. And again, I'm not privy to that information, so you'll have to help me with it because I know what I've been told by different people involved in the project, but I'm not the one writing the grants or putting the information together, so I don't know specifically what's in what pot. But that's just my information from Chad that in the pending grant.
Mike, maybe something we could do either for the next meeting of the entire committee or in the very near future would be to have a discussion of which pots of money exist, how much are in those pots, also what each of those pots actually is allowed to purchase. For example, in the bond length money, it said certain wording of what we were allowed and not allowed to pay for. So that we can go by, what comes out of that pot matches up with what we promised our taxpayers who voted on the bond issue. So we can make sure that we're, with each of the different pots of money, I think we're up to 5 actually now, that out of those different 5 pots of money that we're, making sure we're paying for the correct things, that we're doing things, that we're following the correct requirements. So maybe that's something we could tackle in the very near future. In fact, that's something that I'm sort of working on for myself already, but maybe we could do that as a larger group.
Got to stop.
Susan, this is Steve Planch, and I have a question.
Yep.
Is the moving in the house in one of those pots of money?
No, not yet.
Not yet, no.
Okay. So that should be I don't know how you guys have everything noted, but that'd probably be a big one to note somewhere.
So, but the remediation of the soil underneath where the house will go, which is probably the most toxic of all of the soil, would that be covered under the grants that you are currently writing?
Yes. If that's
Excuse me, you need to identify yourselves when you speak, please.
Okay, that was Breck Perkins. I'm sorry, Sandy.
Sandy, this is Debbie. Yes, the remediation grant does include excavation of soil, which if the house was moved, that soil, Brett's correct, would have to be excavated. It could be capped otherwise, but it would have to be excavated if you were going to put a foundation there. That that money is going to be in the remediation grant.
Hence, could the foundation be part of that remediation grant?
Maybe. We'd have to look at that, see. It would have to be a cap, and I don't know. That might be pushing it, but that is something we could look at.
I mean, we are going to put a slab down, so that's the reason why I'm going for that.
Yeah, if it's just a slab, then yes, potentially that would be part of the cap. Because the remediation grant will include the parking lot, which is part of the cap, the soil that will go on top of the fill, which is part of the cap. So if there's a concrete slab, it could potentially be tied into that cap.
And I know that Chad had looked at that for both the house and the boathouse, Jason and Chad, as capping structures.
Yeah, Nick Keppel here, if I may chime in, that I think what Mike O'Neill is referring to when he comments about, possible use of the state remediation funds related to the house. He's relying on some projections that Chad did, which was based on discussions that he had that he and Rob had with DECD. And right, Mike,
Correct.
Chad, there was a budget that my recollection is there was a budget that Chad did for the current DEC grant, which we're wrapping up, but that part of what Chad did and submitted to our committee is a budget for the roughly the $7 million project, the entire project, including the boathouse, but especially the park related portions of it. And I think, but not only Mike, but the rest of the committee had the impression that his analysis that some of the brownfields remediation monies could be.
Well, I think this is Debbie. It will be helpful, and Susan and I are working on just what she was saying, the different pots of money, the different areas where funds may come from. The town does have money left over from the bonding. It is enough, based on an estimate we have from Chad, to construct the park infrastructure without it doesn't include the remediation, though. So then there will be the grant application to DECD for the remediation. There are other potential grant applications we're looking at, one possibly for the boardwalk, one for some work associated with the living shoreline. We're looking at a number of different ways to try to bring in enough funds, because what we have left over from the bond is maybe enough just for the infrastructure. And what I'm saying that is the electricity, a dock, a public dock, boat ramp, other utilities, and some of the plantings. But hopefully by next week we'll be able to have that and to share with everybody on the committee so they can see the different budgets and options and kind of where they fall into the picture.
Hey, Debbie, it's Steve. What was the dollar value left on that first grant?
The first grant or the bond?
Yeah.
I don't believe there's much left over from the first grant. We're trying to finish it up. We only have a couple weeks left. The money left over from the bond is approximately $534,000.
Okay.
But the
Thanks.
cost estimate to build the park, without touching the house and without any remediation, is somewhere around $515,000.
But Deb, I think one of the things that you said that's important there is the bond has an expiration time. Sorry, the grant has an expiration time. The bond does not. So we can keep moving forward with that, but there's a timeliness for the grant.
Yes.
Yes, so the first grant that was put into play for the $200,000 for the assessment grant, that actually expires at the end of the year. And we've made one final change order that was voted on at the last committee meeting for a certain amount of information in terms of the living shoreline, submerged aquatic vegetation. There were certain items that we were trying to push things forward to not get the 18 permits we need, but to be able to have as much information as we could to move that forward to be, it won't be shovel ready, but to move it at least forward in that direction. And so that money and that change order was voted on at the last meeting. Those meetings and that work has already been, it is already in play. And we're hoping actually by about December 15th that will be completed, and we'll be filing our final draw with Don Friday at DECD, and that grant will then get closed out, and the town will be reimbursed for that money, and will be square in terms of the scope of work that was involved in that first grant. The second grant that we have been working on very diligently. In fact, we had it ready at the end of the summer, and then in September, unfortunately, the state came out with a brand new format, brand new questions, and a brand new application. So we've reworked the entire thing. We're about 90% done. We're still working on some of those budget numbers, but the rest of the actual wording has been, refilled out, moved around, readjusted. And it's unfortunate that we had to sort of waste time to redo it, but their application is their application, and we have to follow their guidelines. However, they have not come out with a new deadline because, of course, the bond authorization hasn't happened because of COVID. So once the bond authorization goes in play and we know what's out there for money and we know the deadlines, then we'll be able to move that forward.
Hey, Nick. Mike Crowley.
Well,
Hey,
and I'd add kind of one more thing we're talking about.
Let Mike Crowley speak for a second.
Go ahead, Mike.
Just ask a question. Debbie, you and Susan, there was a discussion one time that we weren't sure where all the numbers came from. There was some talk that Rob and Jason Vincent got together, and they came up with those numbers. And I thought I remember Chad Frost saying that he couldn't verify those numbers. So my question to you guys is, the numbers that you're using, have you verified those numbers, or are we using the ones that Jason Vincent came up with?
I mean, we verified the number for the remaining money from the bond. We're using actually a budget that came from Kenton Frost. And it was updated in 2020 for some of the construction numbers. And it does have backup with it. It does have a certain amount per square feet and things like that.
Okay, so you're confident with that?
Yes, we're, assuming their estimate. However, we are confident that at least they're in the ballpark.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Mike O'Neill.
Okay, so just to kind of add one thing, Susan, to what you were saying about the buckets, I think the other thing I'd like to talk about this next meeting is we should prioritize some of those buckets, and that should be kind of part of our committee to decide kind of what are the most important parts of the park that we can already start to be having those conversations of what may go and what may stay, and certain things we're going to have to do, but certain things we don't have to do. And it would just be good for the committee, I think, to understand kind of this amount of money we have to spend for these certain things because we have to do them. And then these other things are more elective so that we have a choice. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, Mike. And it's actually something that I was talking to Debbie and a couple of other people. I was sort of flying this up the flagpole with them of I was sort of akinning it to, going to a restaurant and we're, ordering from the menu. Whereas, you have a certain amount of money to spend and, you have to go with what you need. Do you need the main course and you need a glass of water, or do you need the dessert, or, what is it you need versus what is it you want? There's definitely a critical path here of things that we have to make the park, a healthy and safe place so that the town isn't liable if someone gets hurt or sick or, something happens there. So there is a definite minimum of things that have to happen for us to open the park to the public and not have restrictions about, coaches or people being on the park and knowing that there might be, some difficulty or possibility in terms of their own health. So I think we all are aware that there's a very minimum standard that needs to be achieved. And we've also talked a little bit about 2 additional pots of money that might be out there and might be accessible to us for certain things. And maybe we can sort of isolate those parts of the project, thinking that they might actually qualify for 2 other pots of money, not to make it more complicated, but, we're trying to get everything that everyone wants for the park, but we also have to be able to pay for that.
So this is Brian for Sandy. Susan, that's exactly where I think that the tough dynamic comes in this project, is that there are 2 pots and then there are 2 pots more and then there are 2 pots more. And we've got to be flexible as it moves forward of, well, we got this, but we didn't get this. And we got to be able to shift our dynamics and our priorities on the go kind of quickly, but also with an eye, and I forget who said it earlier, maybe it was Mike, it was someone, that, while you got the ground open, put the stuff in the ground at the same time. We don't want to encumber ourselves with more cost by holding off on doing certain things, because then you got to go back and redo things. But we don't want safety hazards, and we want to prioritize what we can do with the money. So I'm fully on board exactly with what you and Deb are proposing and where you're saying we got to go. And I think that shifts and that colors, those answers color the conversation between the town and the Friends of who moves what and who has to control what because of how the grants come in. And then, we got to have a constant ongoing dialogue based on that, in my opinion, because that's the only fiscally responsible way to do it, because we may qualify for more than we anticipate. And wouldn't that be a great problem to have?
Mike, Sandy, just Nick Keppel. Speaking of problems to have, Tim, and I don't think we should shy away from the fact that we're trying to grapple with 2 huge complications of this project. One, I think Rob Simmons, to his credit, but he was major, mover and shaker and proponent of the project. But I think Rob's vision was that this project, including the boathouse, was going to be like a $2.5 million project, not a $7 million project. And then to add to that complication of how dramatically more expensive, especially the cleanup portion of it was the state tells us unequivocally, don't worry about the ship, don't worry about SHPO. And then SHPO becomes a major source of delay, and now a source of somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000, depending on what we do with the building. And for my, I'm not, especially the state reversing itself on the building, to me is not a Friends caused problem. The town bought with taxpayer authorization, the town bought the property, and in retrospect, probably should have done a little better due diligence about, the fact that it included a historic building and it was part of a historic district, and made the seller bear some of the costs of complying with SHPO. But we're stuck with, a $500,000 additional cost that potentially has precious little to do with the boathouse. And part of what I think Mike is trying to raise is who bears the responsibility for dealing with the complication of SHPO reversing itself is a function of who benefits from the building. You know, if the rowing center doesn't use the building at all, then I think their notion would be they would be less responsible for the cost of moving it and renovating it. If they have all the benefit of it, then maybe they bear the lion's share of those moving and renovation costs. And then another what do you call it, path would be for the town and the rowing center to share the use of it. So these are the things that we need to sort out. And obviously, just in the final thought, I think we have to keep in mind that 500 taxpayers voted to spend $2 million for a boathouse park, not just a park. They authorized the spending of $2 million because they anticipated there would be not just a park and not just a park cleaned up, but a boathouse as part of it. That's their expectation. And everybody knew from the beginning that the boathouse was going to be, the building itself was going to be, paid for, raised with monies from friends, and that hasn't changed. But now there's this significant wrinkle of the house and its role in the park, and that's what we're trying to sort out.
This is Greg Perkins. I also want to bring out the point that if we do not move the house, we are not eligible for any grant, right? So hence, without moving the house, there is no park, right? We cannot get the funding from the state so the house has to move if we are going to be able to remediate the park. So per the Office of Historical Preservation, or whatever SHPO is referred to as, but that's the mandate. So, I mean, we're handcuffed by the state of Connecticut stipulating that if the house isn't moved per the master plan that we all agreed to, then we can't proceed with the park.
So, Debbie, is there a mandate that says it has to move? That's something we've never seen, because that was our question. Does it have to move? I mean, right now, there isn't a budget to move it. So if we didn't get any money from the state to move it, we don't have enough money to move it and build the park.
Yeah, my understanding, Deb, was that I wasn't in the room but we do have a document from SHPO, but preceding that document, it's my understanding that SHPO said they wanted it moved because they wanted the historic building to be the first thing that is seen before the boathouse as you go south on 27. So, we have the problem that as Mike explained at the very beginning, between a parking lot, the rowing center, which needs to be next to the park, that also gravitates towards the building being moved. But with SHPO, right, Mike, they wanted it to be the most northerly thing on the structure on the property.
Yeah, just to be clear, the town signed a document with SHPO, an MOU, or I forget the exact terminology. I can dig it out and share it with the group, saying that they, as part of the park project, were going to move the house. And then SHPO basically put a gun to our head and said, if you don't do this, we'll make sure you don't get any funding.
Some of your remarks were, Nick Epple here, were blocked out with a delay. So could you repeat the first part of that? The SHPO document.
So our final agreement with SHPO mandated that in order for us to get funding for the park, we had to preserve the house. And they agreed to the design, final design that we gave them, which is the current master plan of moving the house 88 feet to the north. They said, if we don't do that, we will not get funding.
Well, again, and for Deb and this benefit, Susan, the words I
I don't
Nick,
know
we
if
can't
anyone
hear
else lost Nick. I lost Nick.
Yeah.
you don't have any latitude.
Same here.
Nick, you have to start over again, Nick. We lost the whole thing.
Sorry. What I said was what I remember also from that document is that it no deviation from that agreement without we can't unilaterally change anything about the house without going back to SHPO.
Correct. We need their consent for any modifications.
We gave them a specific plan, a master plan, and a design, and they said yes, they would okay the movement of the building so long as it was done exactly like was proposed. Period. Any change had to be go back to them.
So, Nick, this is Steve. Who has that signed document? You're on mute, Nick.
I took it out from, it was to the committee. Chad has a copy, I'm sure. I know Susan has reported that Jason, left voluminous files. I'm sure we can. I can.
Nick,
Calculated for the full committee for next week's meeting.
No, I was mainly because I thought Debbie said she didn't have the document, so I was just saying.
I don't have the document. Susan may have it now.
Okay, hold on. So as of 2 hours ago, I finally have the document, but for the entire time I've been working here, and I've gone through the entire office of the office that I had inherited, and I was not able to find that document nor a lot of the change orders or files anywhere in the office. So finally, 2 hours ago, I went other places in the town hall and asked if anyone else had a copy of it, and I was able to locate a copy of it. So I have it, but only as of 2 hours ago. So I'd be very happy to share it. I hope that what I have is the correct version. There isn't really a way for me to know that. So if mine matches yours,
I
Nick,
believe
maybe
I
that'll
have the
help me.
final executed document because I think I was on the email chain when it was created. Yeah.
I can also look for that MOU if that's what you're looking for. I might have it somewhere in my files.
If it's signed, Susan, Nick here, if it's signed by Rob, it's the only one because that's the only one he signed.
All right.
Okay, it's signed. It's signed. I just had no way to say if it was the correct version.
So, Mr. Chair, it's Tim O'Brien. If I can make a suggestion, because I don't know that we're dancing around the subject, but there's a lot of moving parts that we're getting at here. I know Rich Word is on the line here. Really, from a town standpoint and from a finance standpoint, if we're talking about the town, it has the burden of moving this, and yet I understand it was a prior administration and everything. But does the town have a need for it? And it's been expressed that Rich has expressed a desire to occupy part of that building. I'd like to hear from Rich what they could envision from a town side so that we could have that more discussion as opposed to, the historical discussion.
So we're clear, Tim, when you say the need for it, you mean presuming it gets moved pursuant to the SHPO order, you mean future need of the building, right?
Future use. Maybe need is the wrong word. Use is the right word, I guess, because it's easier to justify to the taxpayers from my standpoint as the Board of Ed or Board of Finance chair, whatever. Sorry, that if we're going to do that, the taxpayers have a use and we'll get a use out of it, and not just because we're encumbered from it by the state. So I'd kind of personally like to just open it up to Rich a little bit because it makes my decision and my discussions a lot easier from that standpoint.
I'm not sure if you guys are hearing me. I had some trouble with my speaker before. Are you hearing me?
We can hear you fine, Rich. Thanks.
Tim, to answer you real quickly here, what I was looking at as far as usage for recreation was a finished park and a building available. I've never looked at it as far as being ramping up and ramping into different facilities and so forth. I did put together a bunch of different benefits of what we could do as a town if we had a park and if we had the buildings available that were on the master plan. So I don't know if you're looking at what we could do, obviously, with the greenways connecting to the waterways. We could do a lot of different kayaking events, a lot of different paddleboard, fitness classes, obviously the passive recreation that would be available for our residents. There are a number of different ways that we could use that park and obviously for the benefit of the residents.
Thanks, Rich.
So this is Mike. If I could just chime in for a minute. So Rich, and you and I have talked about this very similar paths. We see a lot of different opportunities within rowing, and then a lot of opportunities beyond rowing. And I think one of the things that we have to think about is if we have a park and we're running all these different programs, one, you're going to want to have some office or some way to manage those programs. And two, you're going to have stuff, because if you're doing all these different activities, you're probably going to have some place to put things. So it would make sense to have a facility in the park if we are is the kind of the same.
Storing of the boats, any kayaks or paddleboarding that we would be able to have available. That would require some kind of facility of some sort. Again, when I was looking at it as what we could do there, I was always looking at it as a finished product of what you had in the master plan. So what I would have to do is rethink it, is what we could do. Obviously, the benefit to the town, if we just had open lands on the waterfront and access to the water, that is a benefit. Again, my thinking was always having a facility available there, working in conjunction, obviously, with the boating and the rowing, the Friends of Rowing, and working in conjunction with their events, that we would coexist and have other events going on side by side, working together. And obviously, there's a lot of local nonprofits. Denison Pequot Post Center obviously is one of them right down the road. We'd be able to connect some greenways in the Peace Park. Forgive me, I think it's a Peace Park across the water. Being able to have different outings and boat outings to connect those greenways to the waterways is a benefit.
So it's Tim O'Brien again. I'll just jump in, Mike, if you don't mind, real quick. So I think there's a natural symbiosis here between the Friends and between the town. But I think the cost implications, like I said before, are very fluid right now. Well, I don't necessarily mean the cost. The reimbursement implications, whether we can get DECD grants and that, are very fluid right now. I don't think it's a situation of us versus the town versus Stonington Crew. I think there's a great opportunity here for a mutual use facility, but I think it needs to be developed and designed to a degree that way, where maybe, and now this is, I guess, where Chairman Keppel got us to here to this meeting. It's, does the town move the building because that leverages all the grants that we can get, and the Friends build around it, but we have conjoined space basically? Or how do we sift that all out? Because I know what a rowing machine costs. We don't want it open to the general public on every day of 20, you know, of 365. How do we define those boundaries of where it's a shared space, where it's a friend space, and how do we get to that? Because the park as a whole is really the attraction. You know, that's really the leveraging part, in my opinion.
If I could go real quick, just here's kind of in a nutshell. So we've been working as a Friends on the boathouse structure. And right now, the boathouse that we're proposing is a very simple, unheated barn, effectively. So it's a place to store our boats. It has a second floor space in it that we can train in for probably 3 seasons a year, but it won't be used. That's our current plan for the boathouse. We pared it down to about as simple a structure as we could to get the cost in line and to get something that we feel very good about going forward with. The house, I think, should be a public space. I think the boathouse is a private space. It's the boathouse Friends, you know, facility. What I would propose is the house be a public space, and in the house be public bathrooms. So we meet that requirement for the park. Storage space we have going in the park. I mean, it can be as simple as rakes and brooms and stuff just to clean up down there, but you're gonna need some, you know, access to some space to do stuff if you're running programs down there. And then on the second floor of the house, potentially an office for Parks and Rec, and potentially an office for Sonic and Crew. You know, that's kind of one scenario. And I know I threw 3 scenarios up, but the scenario that I think makes sense to me, and then the one that I've talked about the most with my group, potentially see that going forward, is that there's, if the state really wants this house, and if they're mandating that we keep this house for historic reasons, I think it's fair enough for the town to go back for an HRF grant to get them to pay to do the outside of the house. That's the part they're most concerned about. That's a historic piece they want to keep. They've been very vocal about they don't care what happens inside the house. We can do whatever we need to do to make that work. But I know, Susan, you're already looking at one more in the soup, which is this historic restoration grant, this, you know, from SHPO, and just put it back on them. If you want us to keep this house, if you want us to preserve this thing, that's fine. We'll preserve it, but you're going to have to help us. You're going to have to give us a grant to take care of, you know, the preponderance of the outside of that structure. If we could do that, then I think the inside of the structure, I think the Friends would be happy to participate in helping build that out. If we could get access and get our public, we'll have to put those into our boathouse, and we'll have some costs there. So we'd be happy to move some of that cost over to the house structure. But that's what I'd like to propose, and that's what the conversation I'd like to start talking about as our group. And I think it makes sense for the town. I think it fulfills the need that the state has put on the structure. It benefits us so that I can make a case to our group to raise the money to do it. I think it benefits the town so that if town money has to be. So I think that's really the direction I'd like to try and, you know, kind of steer this group to.
Nick, could I have a moment?
Go ahead.
So there's about roughly 2,000 feet in that house, you know, thereabouts, right? Square footage. And the what we truly need from the town, if, you know, to do this correctly, is basically what would the town utilize the building for, you know, for a recreation or a maintenance building for the park. And then we can plan around that. But we need what is called a program of the intended use of the building or some aspect of it. And so if the town could think about what that program would be, then we could start to build something around it. Without that program, we're kind of lost.
Rick, it's Tim. I agree with you because that defines the scope. Now you've got your arms around the scope.
Yes.
So I agree with you.
And then we just have to make sure we have the money.
Yep.
We're going to have to figure out what grants, and I agree with you, if we can say to the state, do you have a grant to help us restore the house, that certainly would help. Or maybe a way that the town can fit some or all of the moving the house in the town's pot of money if we cut out some other things, some of the more decorative things in the cost estimate, or potentially some of the different plantings. But we need to make sure we get money from the state, otherwise it'll be hard to have any of it happen.
Debbie, I agree. I guess kind of my feeling is I'd just like to start to, we've done a lot of talking about the park, but I'd like to include the house, you know, and again, it's all dependent on what we get for funding. And if we don't get funding, it's going to change. But I would like to at least try and put together what we think is the highest and best use for that facility going forward. And I think it behooves this committee and the town to, you know, start, you know, putting the pieces together for the total park, not just the remediation, but you know, what we do with this park going forward, how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, what facilities are going to be provided, are all going to be a component of the park once it's done. And I think it's important to be talking about that right now.
And we need that information for our grants as well. I mean, we need to be able to explain the end use. Although the DECDs cut a lot of their characters you're allowed to have out of their grant application, so we have to trim what we had before. But I do agree with you that we do need to understand what we're doing with it so we can decide where the money's coming from.
Well, and in some ways, I think it strengthens the grant proposal to say this is what we want to do, and this is the benefit to the town and the community once we do it.
Yeah, I think Nick Keppel here. Part of the challenge, you know, Tim and Deb and all of us, is that we've never had a boathouse park. And so it's difficult to get our minds around what all the potential alternatives are. But on Friends that a lot of research has been done about what other communities have done with boathouse parks. And some have been all public, and some have been all private, and some have been hybrids. And there are very modest operations, and there are, you know, extraordinary multi-million-dollar, you know, serving thousands of people a year kind of operations, depending on the size of the community. So I think that we
So we lost Nick. I have to say something real quick. Sorry, Nick, we lost you for a while there. Lost a lot of what you said. I have another meeting I got at 6 o'clock, so I got to jump off. But I'm happy to continue this conversation because I think we're getting to the heart of what it is, Mike. And I thank you for bringing this up because I think Susan's right and Deb's right. You know, the way that the state is doing the grants, which is going to be key to this. It always has been from moment one that we tried to think about this. It's the state grant money we've got to leverage heavily, and how we propose it and how we sell it to them, and how they've changed their grant application, and when the bonding comes out and when everything comes out is going to be challenging. But what we got to do is be proactively thinking now and engaging, you know, Steve and Mike Crawley and Rich and the town side of where, okay, Breck's exactly right. You got 2,000, 2,200 square feet, whatever it is. What would the town like to have of that? How do we shape that and what that looks like? And how does that fall into play with what the grants that are available and what monies we would have available based on that? And that shapes how Sue writes those grant applications. So I think in some way that we're almost late in doing this, but we're on time because they changed the application process. So it's working out, but thanks for calling this. I do have to jump off. I apologize for that, but I think we're headed down the right path, and to me, we're finally having the discussions they're not difficult because we're all working to the same thing, but they're difficult because they're the real nuts and bolts of how it's going to work. And that's always where the details and the devils are.
Thanks very much, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks,
So
Tim.
this is Steve.
Appreciate it.
This is Steve. So going forward, can we have another meeting so we can drill down on all of Mike's proposals to see which one would be the best based on what both sides or all of us agree on would be the best way to go, so we can start doing these proposals?
I'd be certainly available if we want to do that.
I think that's, I mean, you already started with those, so we might as well take those and see which one's going to fit the best. I mean, it would have to be a group effort so we can have the conversation between everyone.
And we need to determine whether or not we can put moving the house into the remediation proposal, and Susan and I can look at that further.
Yep.
I mean, excuse me, this is Breck again. There may be an argument, Debbie, that you could make that seeing that the parking lot is going in that location, and that's part of the cover, that moving the house enables the building of that parking lot.
Yeah, possibly. We'll have to look at kind of their definitions for what's considered remediation and see what we can do.
Understood.
And Nick here, Mike O'Neill, you'll speak with Rich Ward about sharing ideas and so forth.
Yeah, we've had some good conversations. Rich, you put together a nice list. Makes sense. Again, to Breck's point is if we could start to put together, the scope of what we potentially will use the building for, that'll help kind of derive some of that. Having run programs, I know with the crew team, we got a lot of junk. It's amazing how much gear you have when you have a lot of kids showing up on a daily basis. And so I can promise you, if we're going to run a lot of these programs, we're talking about the park, you're going to have something to anchor, all those activities, and just to have of do we need a place for hula hoops and yoga mats and all that kind of stuff, so that would be very useful. And then again, I think the provision of public bathrooms, and I would think that that's going to almost be a requirement for this park to have some access to bathrooms, and we should talk about how to do that, and how big, and who cleans them, and who takes care of them, and all that kind of stuff too. So that's another.
I know we squeeze this meeting between the end of the workday and dinner, so I'm going to keep it as close to an hour as possible. Anything else that we must take up in anticipation of next week's full committee meeting?
Maybe next committee meeting we decide on when we're going to have this next meeting, sub meeting.
Could we maybe do that in an email chain, or is it has to be publicly proposed?
Well, let me poll folks about, do we try to reconvene again in December or wait till January of this subcommittee?
I think this is very important, especially the fluidity of the grant writing right now, that we need to support them.
I think I'm available to do an hour and a half, so before the new year.
Shall we say try for 2 weeks tonight, 2 weeks from today at 5, same thing?
That's good with me.
Not to get too close to. All right, that's what we'll do. Anything else for the good of the order?
Thank you again, everybody, for taking time to do this.
Yep.
Thank you all.
To that.
Take
All right.
care.
Is there a motion
Thanks,
to
everyone.
adjourn?
We need to adjourn the meeting. Somebody does?
Yes, I said, is there a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning? See
Aye.
by saying aye. Aye.
Have a good dinner, guys.
Motion carries. Night. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Night.